second webinar. The topic of today is industrial electrification from barriers to breakthroughs. And we're very excited to have Jan here. Jan is a top LinkedIn voice and really an expert on industrial or on all things electrification, actually. I started following you, Jan, a couple of years ago on LinkedIn. I think one of the things I remember, and that's definitely also a hot topic in Belgium, is your work that you did around, together with a number of different people, around, let's say, the difference in pricing between gas and electricity prices and how that impacts, let's say, the speed of decarbonization, electrification. So we can definitely dive into that one. It's for me a very interesting one. But yeah, as a first question, could you just tell us, like, how did you get started in this sector? Like, how did you get? What sparked your interest in everything electrification?
Thanks, Jonas. And sorry for dialing in from a conference venue. You might hear a bit of an echo. I'm in a very big meeting room here.
It sounds good.
It sounds good. Excellent. Usually would have my podcast microphone when I do this from home, but not today, I'm afraid. It's just some cheap earbuds. But yeah, what sparked my interest in energy or electrification more specifically? I mean, energy is clearly, as you probably all know, the biggest source of emissions globally. It's of vast importance for our society. It underlies pretty much all economic activity. So it's, by definition, a very important sector. And then also, I think the challenges that we have in front of us of transforming the sector at a speed that we haven't really seen before. Some people get really quite scared by that, and I understand that. But I think it's hugely exciting because it opens up of this need for innovation, and indeed we see so much innovation across the sector, and we're going to talk about industry in a bit more detail later on. But I think it's an exciting space to work in, and it's a very exciting time, very challenging time. But that's kind of what got me into energy and electrification more broadly. I mean, the real benefits of electrification that I can see is that we have an increasingly decarbonized electricity system. We see that in carbon emission intensity, but also the share of renewables and other low carbon sources is increasing in some countries to levels that we never thought would be possible. I still remember the German utilities in the early 1990s. They ran a full-page advert in one of the major newspapers saying renewables could only ever contribute something like 4 or 5% to electricity generation in the long run. The last time I checked, it was more than 50% in Germany. So it really has changed quite tremendously, and electricity is a lot cleaner now. But the second, I think, perhaps less understood aspect of electrification is the efficiency gains this will bring. I'm sure we're going to get into that a bit later in the conversation, but an electrified system, an electrified industrial sector is vastly more efficient. So it's not only using clean electricity, if we decarbonize electricity at speed, but it's also using less energy overall. And I think as a package, that is a pretty good proposition, given that we have just come through an energy crisis with very high fuel prices, and also a discussion that's very live in Europe now, at least, about industrial competitiveness.
Mm-hmm. All right, we are feeling exactly the same, and when we're going to industrial companies as potential customers or current customers, we still feel that sometimes, it's not really clear for everybody like how fast this transition is going, and that is something that we have to emphasize. I feel over and over. And then we're going to dive into this industrial electrification directly. Before that, I just want to add the practical point. So I'm going to be asking the questions for the first 20 minutes, but if people have questions, please put them in the chat, and the last 10 minutes of this webinar will make space for the questions of the audience. But then, the direct link why we invited you in this webinar was because you created an overview for these barriers for industrial electrification, which we found super interesting and is very relevant, of course. Can you explain a little bit why did you do this, how the response has been, what it's about? Take us through it.
Yeah, sure. I must say, I haven't really worked on industrial electrification for that long. Most of my work on electrification was in the transport sector, and specifically in buildings. So industry is a rather later addition to it. And the starting proposition for me was really to understand sort of why do we see such a low uptake of electrification at the moment. When you look at European process heat used in the industrial sector, only about 3% is based on electricity. The vast majority, not all of it, but the vast majority of the remaining 97% is currently from fossil fuels. There's a little bit of biomass in there, biogas, but the vast majority is based on burning gas, coal or oil. So that's a starting point, really. And the question, I guess, that then arises is, well, why are we not seeing more uptake? Also, the speed at which electrification happens is very slow right now in industry. It's a lot less than what we see in other sectors where this is happening at a much more rapid speed. That got me to the sort of discussion around the barriers, what's standing in the way. And my intention really was to harvest as many good ideas using social media and finding out what people encounter either as clients, as companies that might deploy electrified technologies, or as suppliers, for example, suppliers of heat storage or large-scale heat pumps. Or policymakers, what do they observe in the sector? And as a result, I created a rather complex fishbone diagram, which I refined over time. But it was really a joint effort because I got so many comments from people saying, oh, you should include this barrier or change it to that. And I'm sure it's not perfect, but I can show you the result if now is a good time. So you see kind of what the end result has been of that exercise. And I grouped them broadly into 4 categories: economic barriers, technological barriers, infrastructure, and knowledge, just to really understand also what might be the solutions. I mean, that's kind of the next step. This is part of a broader project that we're doing where we're sort of ultimately trying to distill some ideas for what are policy reforms that would actually help unlock this huge potential for electrification, which is probably about 70% plus based on the most recent studies using existing technologies. So very large potential. And how do we actually unlock that? I think we must talk about the barriers in order to achieve that.
Mm-hmm. All right. That's clear. For me, one of the important ones to start with, or the one that we hear the most, is the economic barrier, right? I mean, let's say the high electricity to fossil fuel price ratio. On the residential level, that's even worsened by often higher grid costs for electricity compared to gas costs. That's something, at least in Belgium, that we're very aware of. On an industry level, these grid costs set place less, but of course, still you are a factor 3, let's say, on average. If you look at it purely per megawatt hour, that the electricity price is higher than the gas price. How do you see that? How do you see this barrier being overcome?
I mean, it is one of the most fundamental barriers, ultimately, to electrification, not just in the industry sector, also in buildings, of course, because it makes it a lot harder to incentivize people and get them to invest in these technologies if ultimately your running costs will go up because electricity prices are so much higher than gas prices. But the picture is quite diverse when you look across Europe. So in some places like Sweden, for example, Finland, Norway, there's actually already a very beneficial price ratio, and electricity per unit is sometimes even cheaper than a unit of gas. And that's why we see more investment going into things like large-scale heat pumps, for example, in the industry sector in those places. Whereas, I mean, you mentioned Belgium, Jonas. I think Germany is another culprit where you have a very large, what is called the spark gap, ratio between electricity and gas prices. But how can that be addressed, I think was your question. And I mean, some of this is just a feature of the technology and the efficiency, the transformation of energy to electricity, and there's losses in there, of course. But part of it is also levies and taxation. And in especially the countries with a very large spark spread, actually the portion of taxes and levies can easily be 10, 15, 20%. So that's a political choice, and reapportioning the taxes and levies in a sensible fashion can really help improve the OPEX and the business proposition for electrified end users in industry.
Mm-hmm. All right, no, that's definitely something that we're seeing, and Belgium is definitely a culprit in that one. But we're hoping there are like lots of elections, like all over the world. In Belgium, there is one as well. Hoping for a next government to, let's say, do that tech shift a little bit, at least up to some degree. Maybe coming back to to your graph, are there other points that you would like to highlight that you say like, okay, like what are for you next to the economical also very important barriers that we need to actively work on a lot in order to get towards faster industrial electrification?
I think the difference between, let's say, the transport sector and industry is quite stark. I mean, buying a new electric vehicle, I mean, it's still a complex decision-making process for an individual, but you just buy a new car, right? You might have to worry where you charge it, but a lot of people have off-street charging, and those who don't, there are public chargers available. If you electrify a complex industrial process, you're dealing with a multitude of complexities. You're making sure you have the right kind of heat at the time when you need it, and you don't disrupt the existing process. Or you might even want to be thinking about using waste heat sources and reusing that, lifting the temperature levels up to a more usable degree, and then using them is vastly more complex than just buying a new electric vehicle. So that's part of the issue here, and the knowledge of doing that is not necessarily present in each company. So often you need specialist advice. You need people who actually know how to do this and can do the analysis well. So this is one of the areas I think also where governments can help. But there are some programs where you get engineering assistance. You get people who actually know how to do this and help you prepare a detailed plan to minimize disruption, to make sure you actually get a system that works at the end of it. But I think it's complexity. If I had to put it into one word, it's the complexity of industrial processes and the diversity of processes. I mean, industrial sector is hugely complex. There are many different types of processes that need to be decarbonized, and this makes it inherently more difficult and certainly harder to abate, one might argue, than, for example, road transport.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, no, that's a clear answer. Then I'm gonna transition into a very practical question. So last week, Thomas and myself, we were, or it was already 2 weeks ago, I think, we were visiting a factory where this player is producing insulation materials. And they have an oven. They have two ovens, basically, two production lines with two ovens where they're heating at 80 to 90 degrees. That is currently being heated on gas. So it's a thermal oil system, and then heating the oven actually at 80 to 90 degrees. And actually, like what I've been wondering about. So this customer is wanting to is going to electrify his production lines, and the challenge for him is a little bit that he sees the potential for going for a heat pump system, for example. I think at those temperature ranges, industrial heat pumps could, reach that, and you have the efficiency gains. But the capital cost to invest is quite high in them. Whereas on the other side, there is a rather cheap option, I would say. There is an existing thermal oil system that's then heating the oven to 80 to 90 degrees. The thermal oil system is at about 200 degrees. That's currently being heated by gas. And it could be quite easily, or more easily, let's say, electrified in a simple way with like just a resistance, right? Heating that thermal oil directly. But then you don't have the efficiency gains. So these challenges are actually something that we see quite often in industry. And so you get a kind of a thing that either you invest quite some money into a very efficient heat pump system, or the capex cost is lower, but let's say running costs will be much higher as well. But of course, with like more renewables coming into the grid, maybe you will have more hours with zero electricity costs. So that's a challenging question I find for a lot of these industrial customers. What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, we had the discussion about the spark gap. So, I mean, that's part of it. But I think you mentioned low cost electricity rates, perhaps during hours when there's an oversupply of renewables. We're going to see more of that in the future. We're already seeing very low prices at certain times. I mean, just recently, I think it was last week, I saw someone on, I think it was on X, sharing a map of Europe, again, showing very, very low prices. And if you can take advantage of those prices, for example, by using heat storage, so you're converting electricity that you buy very cheaply into heat in a thermal battery of some kind, and you're then using that later on, or uplifting it with a heat pump again to a higher temperature even, you can actually see how you bring down the cost. But again, that adds, of course, a degree of complexity, and you need to have a way of automating this process and really making sure that you run the system in a way that minimizes costs. But no, it's completely possible to do that with existing technology. It's just not very widespread yet, but I think it will come. You know, that's where I think the industry is headed. There's a lot of companies that are investing heavily in such technologies. And ultimately, I think these solutions will be adopted, especially because companies now are also looking at decarbonization options for their processes, because their investors are essentially asking the same question: what are you going to do about your carbon emissions? So I think there is a demand driver there. It's not enough yet. I think we need to change the policy framework to move faster, but I think there's enough already happening with innovation to really see what the path forward will look like.
All right, great. So and then I'm gonna push you towards a clear like yes or no question. Like in this case, would you advise this customer to buy a heat pump or buy a direct electric system?
Well, I mean, you would want to really look at the economics of that, right? And how they stack up. I mean, one of the issues is often that companies have the expectation of very short payback periods. So, 2 years or even less. Whereas, like a large-scale heat pump, for example, will of course be very capital intensive and last for a very long time. So that's often a hurdle. I would also encourage to look at the OPEX over a longer period of time and really factor that in. But yeah, depending on, I think, the specific process, you make the decision for or against one technology. I don't think it's either always heat pumps or always resistive heating. I think it really depends on the specifics of that process and what makes most sense in that case.
All right, cool. That's an answer. That's a clear answer. I mean, at least we can work with that. Maybe coming like back to the graph you shared and to like breakthroughs. Just like what are some of the cool cases in industrial electrification that you have come across, or some project that you really see they are leading the path forward in industrial electrification?
Well, I mean, there are many. One of the things I've done last year was actually to look at food and drinks industry in a bit more detail and see what projects we're already seeing. And for the reason that your food and drink brands are usually quite well known to consumers, right? We all buy them, and that's why I kind of picked that sector. And I did a thread on beer brewing and electrified beer brewing. There's some fascinating examples. For example, Heineken is putting a very large heat pump in its factory in the Netherlands. Then the process of doing that, but there are also some microbreweries that have used heat pumps to reuse waste heat essentially from the chilling. So you have a chilling process on the one hand where you have waste heat, and you have the brewing process where you need heat, and they're kind of connecting the two. So there's some really good examples that you will be able to find if you just Google beer heat pumps and my surname online. For many other breweries, I think I found 10 or so examples from around the world, not just from Europe. The same goes for whiskey. There's a whiskey distillery in Ireland that has also electrified part of its brewing process. So there are many good examples in the food and drink sector, I think, that people can take some inspiration from. And I mean, one of the reasons why I've kind of used that sector, as I said, was because people can relate to it. And I think after sending out some of these threads, I was asked on the BBC radio show in the morning to discuss beer and heat pumps, which was not the topic I was expecting to cover. But it clearly struck, people could relate to it. It kind of struck a nerve with people, and they could imagine what I was talking about rather than something that's very, very abstract. But yeah, I think the main innovations really coming out, I think this combination of flexibility and electrification and providing services to the energy system, grid services. I think that's kind of where the cutting edge is, and where we're seeing sort of initial projects coming out, pilot projects. It will take some time, I think, for those to really be commercialized and be scaled, but that's clearly where I think things are headed.
All right. Yeah, that's great. I mean, at least in Belgium, we have quite some beer brewing companies as well, so that's great to get some inspiration from. I think also there was recently announced that there's like a coffee brewing company, and maybe like there are lots of examples indeed from food companies that are actually like pushing this way forward. Coming back like to these companies, like suppose I am a company that wants to get started on this road to electrification. Any good sources you would say, or like how to get started, to gain more knowledge about this topic, apart from following you on LinkedIn, of course?
Well, it's actually, this is actually a really good question, and it depends on where you are in the world, right? In some countries, there's excellent information already out there. For example, in Germany, the government provides very detailed information for companies from each of the sectors, what the options are, and there what is called sort of energy efficiency networks, where information is being shared between industrial players. But this is not the case in every single country. So in some countries, there's very little information. Internationally, I mean, there's great case studies from the IEA. For example, the Annex 58, which is, I mean, that's the one on high temperature heat pumps, for example, in industry. And you can really see specific case studies. You can find out who the manufacturers are. But I think the recommendation would be find someone who really understands this topic well, and get some guidance from that organization, from that person. But it will depend where you are. Yes, there's no kind of pan-European organization that provides that service at the moment. I mean, there's European Heat Pump Association and various business associations that do some of that, but it has to be tailored to the specific context in the specific country.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Nice. Definitely some good sources there. One question that we got was around a customer who currently have a combined heat and power installation. So they are producing, let's say, locally steam and electricity with a gas turbine combined heat and power installation. They shared like, okay, we're actually facing kind of a double issue here, because if we transition away from our combined heat and power installation on gas, then we're losing our, let's say, steam production. We need to electrify it, and then we're losing the local electricity production from that CHP unit. So it's actually kind of a, how to say, kind of a double whammy in how it impacts them. So I was wondering, do you have any ideas, thoughts on these kinds of challenges? Because that sounds like a very challenging context for this company.
It is a very challenging context, and I mean, this is even, we're talking about CHP here, of course. In many places, a lot less efficient technologies are being used, and they have historically just been so much cheaper because of the economics, low fuel prices. So it's quite difficult to sell electrification to a company like that. I think ultimately it's the role of the regulatory framework to enable that from happening. I mean, in this case, it's the local generated electricity and the heat that's needed. But with a grid connection, you still get your electricity. So I guess the benefit is the low cost of the electricity, I presume.
Yeah, exactly. So having that combination, and it's something actually that we're seeing with quite some of these companies, that indeed that they have a CHP unit, and it's very hard to move away from it and going towards an electric. As you said, like they now renewed their CHP installation for the next 10 years when we were talking with them. So yes, they didn't get convinced in time to switch to electric. It's a hard challenge for a lot of them. I see in the live stream we're getting in a question from Dennis. Dennis asking, said, thank you for your question. So you mentioned levies and taxes help to address the spar gap obstacle to industrial electrification. And he gives the example that in Canada there is significant opposition to existing carbon charges, and many people expect reduction or removal of the carbon charges. Do you feel the same political resistance to carbon charges on fossil fuels exist in Europe? Is there a risk of actually taxes and levies being reduced on CO2, which would actually still increase even spark gap?
It's a great question. I mean, the industry sector in Europe is subject to the emissions trading system, which is European-wide, but that doesn't include all industry. So there are certain criteria. It's the energy-intensive industry. It's not all of manufacturing. So not the entire sector is covered. But we had the emissions trading system for, I think now, almost 20 years. I think it's 2006 when it started. So that's been in place for a long time. And there is also now a new system coming that will cover buildings and transport. I can see certainly a political discussion starting once that hits in 2027. Already when it was negotiated in Brussels, there was a lot of discussion about how fair that is and the impacts on low-income households, etc. But for industry, I think the main question is competitiveness. What if we have high carbon prices that face industrial customers in Europe, and we have imports that do not face those carbon charges? There's a mechanism. I mean, this goes beyond the scope of the webinar. I guess you might want to do a separate one on that because it's a fascinating topic. But we have an instrument in Europe which is called the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So it's essentially putting a price on carbon of imported products, and that will help address that. At least that's what the Commission is hoping to some extent. But yeah, the question is a good one because you have so many different options for reforming the current regime of taxes and levies. And some of them are politically more difficult than others. There's no doubt. But to an extent, it just means to redistribute them between the fuels. So your overall burden of taxes and levies might not change at all, but you're just reapportioning them in a way that encourages electrification. That's one of the options. And that's exactly what we have seen in, I think I mentioned Finland and Sweden before. That's exactly what they have done.
Yeah, indeed, that's true, and those are great examples. Maybe as a last question before we wrap up this webinar, and you mentioned also like flexibility being key to improve the business case. Some, as you said, like with prices being at some hours very low with sun and wind taking over our energy markets. This goes into this is a little bit difficult for some of these companies because they are actually quite risk averse and they try to be exposed to price fluctuations in energy as little as possible. But then, of course, you lose some of the price arbitrage potential. What would you advise these companies? Should they go for more dynamic pricing? Do you think that's a good way to help this electrification journey along?
Again, I mean, there's so many different options. You could also think about power purchase agreements, where you're essentially buying your electricity directly from a generator at a discount, ideally, and that's exactly what some companies are doing, right? So it's not just flexibility and taking advantage of time dynamic pricing. I think it's also PPAs. That could play a role. There are actually now some instruments emerging in the Netherlands and in Germany already, where essentially what the risks are around the fluctuations of future energy prices and how do you hedge against those risks. So the system in the Netherlands essentially guarantees you that if electricity costs fall below a certain level, or go above a certain level, that there is some sort of compensation mechanism to make sure that you're still not out of pocket, even though prices might be very different from where you expected them to be. In Germany, it's carbon-based, so there's a new mechanism that essentially is like a carbon contracts for difference system. Again, I can't really go into the details because we don't have the time, but it hedges against the risk of a fluctuating carbon price. So there are ways of protecting against volatility of prices, and I think hopefully we're going to see more mature business models that really work for companies so they feel confident in making the investment decisions.
All right, great. That was, I think, last question that we had. So thank you very much, Jan, for taking the time to talk to us. I feel it was really interesting. I mean, I see a lot of your LinkedIn posts coming by, and but it's always very cool to talk to someone in person. So happy that you could make the time for us. And yeah, good luck with what you're doing. And I think you're doing a great job in pushing this electrification. Really, really necessary move.
Thanks, Jonas. Much appreciated. And I will be sending my next LinkedIn post very shortly about industrial electrification and this webinar.
Great. All right. Thank you, Jan.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.